Other problem is the fatalism of saying it can't be done. Shi-ka-ta It's never going to happen. And excess fatalism is just as corrosive as irrational exuberance. One of the biggest obstacles to doing what needs to be done is the feeling we tried several times, it failed.
こんにちは皆さん。ビジネス Success Japan のポッドキャストへようこそ。Hello everyone and welcome to the Business Success Japan podcast. This is your host, Liddy Buchelman. This podcast is for those who want to develop or strengthen the communication skills, cultural savvy, insights into current trends and conditions, and mindsets that are essential in a Japanese business environment. The helpful, practical suggestions and engaging insights offered here provide listeners with the in-depth cultural context needed to achieve their own version of success while collaborating with Japanese counterparts. In today's episode, I'm very excited to share a conversation I had with Richard Katz. Richard has worked for decades as a journalist working on the Japanese economy, and he has written 2 books on Japan, The System That Soured and The Japanese Phoenix. He is now working on a 3rd about how to nurture a new generation of high-growth, innovative, small and medium enterprises in Japan. He's published various op-eds and essays in publications such as Foreign Affairs, The Financial Times, Toyo Keizai, and the Wall Street Journal Asia. But before we get into the interview for today, let's go over a little bit of Japanese. In the previous episode, we learned the word kotowaza. 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 A kotowaza is a proverb or saying. One of the more well-known ones people know from Japan would be, the nail that sticks out gets hammered down. But there are many others, and be sure to check out the previous episode with Colin Savage to hear the kotowaza that has most shaped his approach to intercultural communication. In this episode, I want to introduce the common phrase, shi-ka-ta gaない. Shi-ka-ta gaない. Shi-ka-ta gaない. Shi-ka-ta means roughly way or method. Nai means not, or not existing, while ga marks the preceding word as the subject. So this phrase means more or less, there's nothing that can be done, there's no use, or even it can't be helped. Another common phrase is shouganai, which essentially means the same thing. You will hear this phrase used often in the workplace and in everyday life, however, so be sure to keep your ears open to learn how they're used in the wild. And I also just have one more note before we officially get into today's interview. If you're enjoying the podcast and want to keep the content flowing, please consider doing one of 3 things. If you haven't already, please go ahead and follow or subscribe on whatever platform you're using, and consider leaving a review as well. This helps the podcast reach new listeners who could benefit from the information shared here. If you have a favorite episode, please go ahead and share it with a friend or colleague who you think would enjoy it. And if you would like to help make sure that I stay well caffeinated enough to keep putting together these episodes, please consider offering financial support at the podcast's new Ko-fi page. You can find the link to do so in the description of the episode. So thank you so much in advance, and let's get into today's conversation.
I'm Richard Katz. I'm the New York City correspondent for weekly Toyo Keizai, which is one of the 3 leading business magazines in Japan. I've written a couple of books on Japan. I've been just working on Japan for the past 40 or more years. And I've written a new book, which for now we're hunting for a publisher, on reviving entrepreneurship in Japan. And I say reviving because it was entrepreneurship in the Meiji era and in the post-war World War II era. It was the entrepreneurship in the Meiji era and the post-World War II era, which really created those economic miracles. So we're not talking about grafting onto Japan something different. We're talking about reviving something that the Japanese have done before and could do again.
That sounds very interesting. I hope that things work out with the publisher soon, because I would love to read it. So why Japan? Why did you decide to focus your work on Japan specifically?
Because in my younger days, I was Christopher Columbus. I headed out to one place and I found myself in a different place, and somebody else paid for it, which in my case was scholarship money to go to college. I was interested in European history. I was part of the anti-Vietnam War movement, and there were no courses at Columbia on Vietnam, but there was a 2-part seminar on China and Japan. at that point, all I knew of Japan is when my parents as a kid would buy me a toy, 3 days later it would break, that I knew it was made in Japan. So that's the image of Japan back then. And Japan taking this course seemed the most fascinating country. It was so dramatic. It was up, it was down, it was up again, it was down again. It had avoided being colonized by the Europeans in the 19th century. Only Japan and Thailand succeeded in that. The US-Japan trade wars were breaking out. So there's just all sorts of, tremendous interest on my part in it. And so I got captured, and it's sort of like asking, how do you fall in love with your spouse? You have no idea, but there's something very intriguing about that topic or that person.
Yeah.
And I still find it endlessly fascinating.
Yeah, I would hope so. But there's always more to learn or more depth to gain from any country. But yeah, it's also interesting that you pointed out how back in the day, Japan was known for cheap manufacturing, whereas nowadays it's kind of famous for its quality and its attention to detail. So it's interesting to see how things have changed.
Yes. And people below a certain age have no memory of when it was regarded as producing shoddy stuff. But people also below a certain younger age have no impression of when Japan was considered this dynamo that was going to, take over the world economically. So the images of Japan, as well as the reality, keep changing from generation to generation.
So then we had been talking, and we kind of wanted to take a different structure for today's conversation. We wanted to zoom out a little bit. So a lot of the conversations on this podcast tend to revolve around very specific things to do with doing business in Japan or establishing yourself in Japan, coping with the work culture in Japan. But today, Mr. Katz wanted to kind of highlight the megatrends that are kind of underlying Japan, and they're based on almost the culmination of the work he's been doing so far. So why do you think people should take the time to look at these megatrends instead of kind of getting caught in the weeds like many of the conversations we've been having here?
Well, I think you need both forest and trees. And if you don't have both, you don't really know what's going on. But I do think that, Japan has been caught in 3 lost decades in a row economically. And it's really a tragedy because it would not have to make that much change in order to thrive again. But so far, mainly because of the political situation and lack of leadership, it has failed to do so. The problems, in my view, are eminently solvable. And the question is, what's the likelihood of them occurring? What would have to occur? In my view, in every country that grows, you have entrepreneurship as one of the key ingredients. It's often companies, as they get older and older, sort of get set in their ways as do people. And in vibrant countries, you have companies replacing each other. So, for example, look at the top couple dozen electronics hardwares in the United States. A third of them didn't even exist a couple decades ago. Others exist, but they were small. They weren't even the Fortune 500. If you look at Japan, it's the same 2 dozen electronics hardware companies that were the top 2 dozen 30 or 40 years ago are still the top 2 dozen. And yet they've all lost sales. The top 10, every single one of them has lost sales in the last 15 years. Sony, which used to put out must-have product after must-have product, was terrific in the analog era. It failed to adjust. It tried. It failed to adjust to the digital era and could not come up with revolutionary products that people really wanted to buy. And so, yes, it's still a big company. It's still around. This is typical of what happens to so-called elephants, these decades-old giant firms. General Motors is still around, but it's not set the trend in automaking. IBM is still around, but does not set the trend in computers. Sony, again, the same thing. So if Japan is to revive, overall, part of the recipe has got to be a revival of entrepreneurship where new companies, new challengers can replace some of the older, once superb firms that have grown kind of stale. And so, well, if you look at the top, what's going on in terms of top politics, elite business thinking, there seems to be a lot of stasis. There doesn't seem to be a lot of motion. But if you look underneath the surface of society, there's a number of these trends, which I think are changing things and have the potential, no certainty to be sure, but have the potential of really coming to fruition, reaching critical mass, and therefore helping Japan revive. And that's one of these things. In doing the research for this book, I just learned all kinds of stuff. I was like a kid in a candy store. There's just so much interesting stuff going on in Japan, and so many smart people in Japan writing about it that most Japanese, not to mention most Americans, are really unaware of it.
Especially if it's your own country, it can be very easy to overlook things that are changing. It's almost the boiling frog situation where you don't really notice what's going on until it's almost too late.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's one of the good things about learning about another country is you actually understand your own country a lot better.
Definitely, especially when it comes to culture, at least in my experience. So let's just dive right into these 6 megatrends then. I'm really excited for this conversation and learning more about them. The first one I wanted to highlight here was the shift in generational attitudes. So kind of the difference in ways of thinking between the different generations in Japan. Could you break that down a little bit for us?
Sure. People have this image that, Japanese are conformists, Japanese don't want to fight the crowd. They would rather choose security over, say, freedom or independence or making their own way. And a lot of these are sort of either cultural myths altogether or are products of a certain time and place. And one of the myths is, Japanese, they all want to work for big, prestigious companies. No one wants to take a chance on starting their own company, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, it's really not true. It's a product of certain circumstances. One interesting thing was, I've done this for years, meeting, in groups, these young women, career women, Tokyo-based or, Osaka-based. And I asked them, in terms of your hopes and dreams, ambitions, frustrations, are you more like your grandmother or more like your counterpart in New York City? And they all say, oh, my counterpart in New York City. And so there is this general change, and culture is sort of, how culture manifests itself in behavior really does change from generation to generation. So one of those guys I was talking to, he runs a private equity firm, was saying, in my grandparents' generation, just after World War II, they went to school without shoes, many of them. For them, a secure, permanent job at a company with a decent salary was nirvana. That was great. And my father's generation, it was boring. Now Japan was no longer poor, had reached a certain level of affluence, and they didn't like the job, and they were bored with it, and they weren't challenged by it. And they were very, very frustrated by it, but yet they felt there was no other choice. This was all they could do. And they were very frustrated people in that way. So now in my generation, not the majority, but people more and more of a thin minority are people who are willing to sort of switch jobs, people who were, especially the skills in high demand, like people in information technology, will even become consultants, self-employed, and not even have a permanent job, but that's by choice, as opposed to the part-timers who have no choice. And so you've gotten, generationally, at both ends, you've gotten people who've gotten more conservative because the times seem so insecure. But you've gotten a thin and growing slice of people who are saying, yeah, I'm willing to work for a company and switch companies. One company I know for this, they were hiring a bunch of mid-career people in digital marketing because their in-house people didn't have these skills. And there's one guy who'd worked there for several years, and they gave him a good salary. And he came to the president, and about a 200-person company, said, "This is great. I thank you for. I love working here, and now I'm on to my next job." And her husband said, "Wait a minute. We gave you a chance about money." He goes, "No, money's great." He said, "Well, why are you leaving us? We gave you a chance. We trained you. We did this." He says, "Yes, and thank you very much. I'm very grateful." He says, "So then why are you leaving?" He said, "Well, this was a terrific adventure. Now I want my next adventure." And so people don't think of it. Where that shows up is among people who came to adulthood, let's say after 1990, particularly those who have the highest 20% in education and talent and stuff, their willingness and actual carrying out of job switching or even starting companies is much higher than a previous generation. Attitudes toward gender relations, which is a second megatrend, are very, very different generationally. And so people feel very, very frustrated. And so companies themselves have had to respond by accepting more mid-career hires, particularly in areas where there's a skill shortage. And so I think all sorts of attitudes that people have are very different generationally, and that has effects on all kinds of parameters of Japanese life.
Yeah, and especially from the perspective of Americans, it makes a lot of sense thinking back to World War II. I'm currently reading a book called Embracing Defeat about post-World War II Japan and everything that they endured in that time period, and just the prolonged economic issues and suffering that, of course, in the States, we had our own hardships during World War II, but we never encountered this prolonged occupation after and the economic prolonged suffering for the population there. So it does make more sense in context looking at maybe to Americans, it might seem like clinging to something that doesn't exist anymore, but it makes more sense when you see how that wasn't really that long ago, that sort of economic situation where having security was the ultimate goal, and having economic security especially. So just moving along, because I want to make sure that we can cover everything today. Can you tell us a little bit about the issue of the aging population in Japan? It is a topic that we've covered a couple of times, but would you mind breaking it down a little bit more for us?
Sure. And again, let me do this in the context of, because all sorts of ramifications of the aging. It produces stresses in the political system. If you spend the money to support the aged, then you're going to tax the people, working age people. It produces all sorts of conflicts. But in the context of economic recovery and entrepreneurship, one of the things to look at is you've got about 600,000 healthy, profitable small and medium companies, which are in danger of going bankrupt, not because they're in trouble, but because the owner is 65 or 70 or 75 years old. And their kids, again, part of the generational change, their kids don't want to take over. Whereas in the past, it would be, this is my business, you're going to take over. And it was just given as a matter of course, you would take over. Now the kid doesn't want to take over, male or female. And they have to find a successor. And because of things going on in the banking situation and what's involved in it's called a personal guarantee, it's hard to find someone who's willing to take on that debt to the bank and guarantee their house, their firstborn, whatever, if the company fails. Well, these older companies, first of all, there are about 600,000 which are in risk of going under in the next 5 or 10 years. And there's up to 5 or 6 million jobs that are at risk. And so that's a tremendous drag on the economy. The other thing with the demographics is that if you look at the performance of companies led by an older person, they're really inferior to performance of someone who's led by a person in their 40s and 50s. And one reason is, again, the stability versus choice issue, which is that the person who's older is not thinking about where do I want the company to be in 20 years. He's thinking about how do I make sure the company survives when I pass from the scene, either through death or retirement, so that my 50 employees don't lose their jobs, so the company survives. And he's thinking, if I make this big investment and it doesn't work out, what's the risk if I do that? Whereas somebody who's younger is thinking, well, one is where do I want the company to be in 20 years? But secondly, what's the risk if I don't make that investment and I fall behind my competitors? It's a different perception of where the risk is. And I know a case where there was a metallurgical firm, had an older employee, he wanted to retire and have his plant manager, his 43-year-old, take over. The plant manager said, I'd like to do it, but I can't take on this personal guarantee for all the debt the company owes. That I lose everything if there's a problem. Well, the Japanese private equity firm bought the firm. They made this 43-year-old the CEO. In 4 years, they tripled their sales. They quadrupled their profits. And the way they did it was they invested a lot of money in new, most modern machinery and in capacity expansion. And all these banks that didn't want to lend to the company without a personal guarantee, which is too risky for the borrower, suddenly they were falling all over themselves to lend to this company because it was a private equity firm that had vouched for it. And so it got the finance to be able to do it. And the mindset of the 43-year-old was, I say, quite different. So what we really need is a vehicle, improvements in finance and other things, which allows this generational change in ownership. The other side of the coin is that, a lot of companies, people have to retire at age 60. Well, 60 is the new 50, People aren't as old as they used to be at age 60. They don't want to retire, but they have to retire. And you have this incredible wasted resources, which is all kinds of people who may not be visionaries, but they have experience in the ABCs of how you manage company. One of the biggest problems of new companies is you get people who've got vision, but they really lack managerial skills. And if they could hire these people as consultants and in various ways, that would be a tremendous, tremendous help to these new companies getting off the ground. And it's really a wasted resources of sort of the younger elderly. So they're not really older, they're just sort of really upper middle age. But it's a tremendous, the people 60 to 65, retire managers, that's a tremendous waste of resources. So the demographic issue is really a double-edged sword. It really hurts in many ways. It makes the need for reform even greater, but it makes it more difficult to actually implement the reform. And it does create these political fissures, which again, make the need for reform more manifest.
No, that's fascinating. Do you see any of these changes in finance or in hiring practices, or even maybe, I don't know how to articulate this, but maybe having recruiters that specialize in these experienced, older, middle-aged individuals who could do great consulting work or kind of managerial work coming into companies? Is anything happening on that front, or are these still more just ideas that kind of need to take root?
Well, on the issue of mid-career hires, which is, the traditional problem was that if you quit a good job to take a job in a startup, and it fails, as most startups do, you'll never get a good job again of that type. Well, that's changing. And so the labor market is becoming much more fluid. So that's a good thing. There are a whole bunch of consulting firms that are growing up in Japan on all sorts of areas. For example, information technology, which even big companies don't really use it to their best advantage, but small and medium, there's a huge digital divide. And so it's all sorts of consulting companies. Your question's a good one, and I've not actually looked at it as yet, is whether among these consulting companies there are people who say, okay, let's take these people who have retired and looking for their second job. And so a lot of them start mom and pop shops, but let's utilize them. I suspect there are, and it's one of these things that people have not yet really written about. I suspect also it's something getting off the ground. It is not yet a mass thing, but this is one of these under the surface trends that people have not looked at. And the question always is that just the exception that proves the rule and makes money for those particular companies, but does not turn the big ship of Japan around? Or is it the harbinger of a broader trend? And that I simply don't know. Mm-hmm. But it's absolutely one of the things to look at.
Moving on to another trend, which is issues surrounding gender in Japanese society.
Sure. Well, one of the biggest things, you walk into a new Japanese company, and even not so new, but something that say started in the last 10 or 20 years. That was a growth company. And one of the things you find when you walk in, besides sort of the buzz of excitement, which you don't really see at some of these older, stodgier companies or people a little jaded and frustrated, is the huge number of women working there and in managerial posts. And the reason is because womenomics was a fraud. I mean, it's false advertising. There was a lot of promises made and not kept. Women simply do not get promoted in the same way that men do. And they set quotas. The quota that Shinzo Abe set in 2013 for, I think it was 20% of managers being women, was the same thing that Koizumi had goal he'd set 20 years earlier. And it's not happening. Women, when they do reach, say, a kacho level of manager or section head, they're much older than the men were. And once you reach a certain age, you're less likely to found a startup. And so what's happened is bright, ambitious women, educated women who are feeling very frustrated are flocking to both foreign companies, but also newer companies where they really have a chance to move to the top of the ladder. There's a case, there's a company called Oschool, and it was a small 4-person division of a office supplies company. And people, both men and women, had joined it from larger companies. One guy who's now a manager there was from Itochi, which was much, much bigger. There's another woman who was from a convenience store chain, and she went to it. And they both went to it because they wanted to get on the ground floor of a growing company. But the woman that I'm speaking of felt, well, she had an opportunity to climb the managerial ladder that she never would have had at this more traditional company. And what happened was in 1986, Japan promulgated the Equal Opportunity Law, which promised women equal opportunity in employment, including promotion, and including whether you're pregnant or not. But there's no agency in Japan in charge of actually enforcing the law, in the way that there's an agency in charge of the financial services agency in charge of making sure that financial services companies, banks and insurers and investment banks follow the law. There's nobody. So companies just do not promote women. And despite all the talk of change, there's been some change, yes, but nowhere near what was promised or expected. And so these women who had previously gone to these 2-year universities where you get your MRS degree, all the skills you need to be a good wife, started flocking to 4-year universities, in the expectation of being able to get the jobs. They didn't get the jobs. So here they're very educated. And there's this huge gap between their ambitions and their talent on the one hand, and the ability to realize it, which created a tremendous amount of frustration. It also was one of the things that led women to marry later, because they want to get that career in and not get fired or have fewer children when they do get married. Women repeatedly say they'd love to get married at a certain age, say 25, and have 2 kids. They get married at 29 and have 1 kid. It's not their first choice. It's what's on the menu of possibilities. And so there's a lot of frustration, and people do find that in these newer companies, they have more of a chance. And I think that is one of the really big societal trends that's going to affect a lot of things that I think we're only beginning to see the ramifications of it. We've not yet seen it really in politics, but I think we will. Eventually gender gaps in voting and all sorts of things. Mm-hmm. But and also means for the companies, traditionally one of the biggest problems in starting a company is being able to get skilled people at all entry level and managerial level and scientists, et cetera. And so a lot of these companies are able to hire a lot of these very talented, skilled women because, they're going to want to promote them, other companies won't. And so they really have an opportunity to find people. So the need of women for good jobs and these startups for good people is sort of meshing. And it's one of these trends that people haven't looked at, but it's a situation that did not exist 20 years ago and opens up possibilities for the broader economy that just simply did not exist 20 years ago.
You mentioned that women just get promoted at older ages. Does that have more to do, in your opinion, with the types of jobs that women are hired for in the first place, the track they get funneled into once they're in the company, or what causes that? Because these older, more traditional Japanese companies are kind of notorious for promoting just based on length of service. So how do women fall behind in a system that, in theory, they're supposed to just be shuffled along based on length of tenure?
Well, one is that, I think something like 50%, 57% of women employees, I have to go check, make sure that's accurate, but I think some are non-regular employees. So they're not going to have a chance for promotion anyway. And they didn't take it because that's what, it used to be women who would have jobs, get married, have kids. The kids have grown to a certain age, they go back to work, and they wanted to take part-time jobs because they also want to raise the kids, or after the kids have grown up, they were quite happy to do so. This is a case of what jobs are out there, are being offered. And the same thing is true for men to a lesser degree. One of the ways that companies responded to the Equal Opportunity Law was to create these 2 different tracks. And one was sort of the promotion track, the elite career track, that was sort of what's called the clerical track, which became nicknamed the mommy track. because the career track was overwhelmingly men and the clerical track was overwhelmingly women. But most of it is simply prejudice. If you look at the jobs that women have, if you look at their career, if you look at all of these things, maternity leave, all sorts of issues, and you separate that out, you're still left with about 40-50% of the gap in wages and the gap of employment having to do with sheer prejudice of what jobs do they get, what promotion levels do they get. And then people find excuses to do it. So for example, the law says equal pay for equal work. Well, you tweak the job in some little tiny way. You say, well, it's actually a different job. And when you go to court, now there's no agency enforced no agency mandated to enforce these laws. So the victim has got to sue, whether it be a man or a woman. The victim of pay discrimination or promotion discrimination has got to spend the time and money to sue themselves. And the courts have almost overwhelmingly agreed with the companies. Oh yeah, it's a different job because, you do X on Thursday instead of Wednesday. And there are lawyers who just, instruct companies how to tweak it so they'll pass muster. I spoke to one lawyer in the who always represents the employers. And he's only lost one case on this equal pay thing. And he said when he did, the company went back to him and said, well, okay, how do we tweak the job now to make a difference? We can now resume. And also people promote the people that they want to work with. And so a lot of it's very, very subjective. And I mean, Japan is certainly not the only country in which this is true, but it is true. Other countries have moved earlier and faster toward changing. Japan is really one of the biggest laggards. Things are changing, but very slowly and far, far behind the rest of the rich countries. And it's basically simply prejudice. Companies that say we promote few women say we don't have any qualified women. It's a big deal.
Could spend a whole episode just talking about that, but for now, we'll just move on to the next megatrend, which is globalization.
Sure. Now, this is really interesting. This is one which was more prominent in terms of its absence in Japan. When I went to Berlin to look at some of the newer companies there, one of the things that really shocked me was, I remember one company in particular. This is a German company, a Berlin-based company. The top managers are Germans, but the staff was from all over Western and Eastern Europe, with a few North Americans thrown in. English was the common language, and which is, I guess, is good for Americans who don't, only speak one language. But it was incredibly cosmopolitan, and I realized you never find that in Japan. Now you don't find it as much in the U.S. either, for various reasons. We don't have, I think, a 200 miles circle around Hamburg, there's like 20 countries, right? Whereas 200 miles around Detroit, you got one country, and it's not that different. And it makes a difference because people from different countries have different ways of doing things and different ideas. It doesn't necessarily mean that all of their ideas are better, but you get a variety of ideas to choose from. You have cross-fertilization of ideas. So in Japan, what you lack is executives at companies, employees at companies, that sort of thing. On the other hand, if you look at things like the ratio of trade to GDP, that has really increased in Japan a lot in the last 20 or 30 years. So Japan is much more open to products from foreign countries. You go to an office and you'll see row after row of, say, Dell computers. You'll see Windows on machines because Japan has not developed its own software system for PCs because NEC is a proprietary system. You see that not enough foreign companies working on Japanese soil. Out of 196 countries, Japan came in 196th, just behind North Korea, in the ratio of what's called foreign direct investment, which is companies either inward foreign direct investment on Japanese soil, which means either foreign companies setting up a new plant or store or whatever, or else buying a Japanese company and making it better. And countries improve from that. So globalization is a trend that is improving productivity, sharing technology all over the world. And while it's happening to some degree in Japan, It's happening much more slowly, and Japan is at a loss because of it. And again, one of the techniques, and I think there'll be pressure for this, is if you look at software engineers, just regular run-of-the-mill software engineers, Japan has a few 100,000 fewer engineers, qualified engineers, than its companies actually need. By 5 or 6 or 7 years from now, media says it's going to be more than 500,000. Now that means that companies can't do what they ought to do. And while everybody's getting fascinated with Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies and blockchain and artificial intelligence, that's all fine and well and good, but you got to walk before you run. And if you don't have the basics, someone can invent a great AI stuff, but if you don't have people at the companies who know how to use it, what good is it? And so I think what's going to happen is that not only do the people who have this expertise, the software engineers in Japan, command higher wages, be able to switch jobs, but Japan's going to have to import a lot of software engineers from other countries, or else it simply will not be able to. The big companies are going to have to operate overseas where they can hire such people. How is Sony or Panasonic or Hitachi or any of these people going to do well globally? And these companies do depend on global markets. How from a Japanese base if they can't hire the kind of people they need to hire? So I think the pressure for globalization, to do more globalization, as well as the changes that have already occurred because of globalization, are going to become increasingly powerful over the coming decade, and Japan really has to catch up. If it doesn't, it's not going to revive. And one of the things I noticed is that when you look at the people who founded some of these new companies, a disproportionate number of them have some kind of international experience. Mikitani at Rakuten, his father, did he teach at Harvard or Yale? I think he taught, I forget, I think he taught at Harvard or Yale, and Mikitani went to Harvard Business School. Zozotown, he lived in Stanford, San Francisco for some years. A guy who formed another company, Uglena, it's called, had gone to Stanford. And when he had his idea for a new product, people said, you should start your own company to do it. Whereas if he stayed in Japan, it would not have occurred to him. But in Stanford, everybody's trying to start a company. And so you see among those people who start companies and the ones that really succeed and do well, they have an awful lot more international experience than the people who don't. And it's not just that ideas from elsewhere are better, some are not. I mean, there was people in America benefit, the auto companies in America did better when the Japanese companies came here because they learned things from the Japanese company. The point is to be exposed to a variety of ideas and be able to pick from the world's best. And you don't have that unless you have that constant interaction. And Japan simply does not have enough of that. It's getting more, and that's creating pressures, and that's a good thing. But it's one of the subterranean trends which will need to grow. It's grown somewhat, but not enough. And all around the world, globalization is changing how people think and do things.
Yeah.
Sometimes not for the better, but in a lot of ways, yes.
That's for sure.
Yeah.
But moving into the next mega trend, could you tell us a little bit more about the technological change specifically, digital transformation? You alluded to that in globalization just because they're so tightly interlinked, but could you tell us a little bit more about that specifically?
So there are two things. One is that when you have a change in technological regime, it really requires new business institutions all over the place. People, I think, underestimate how much technology changes social life. So for example, before the advent of the railroad, a clock in Kansas City, Missouri and Kansas City, Kansas would not necessarily read the same time. They could be 10, 15 minutes apart. There was no need for everybody to have accurate timepieces. But when the railroads began and you had to get on the railroad schedule, people had to set their watches to the time that the railroad kept. It was called railroad time. The suburbs came about because of railroads. The light bulb created nightlife, the notion of nightlife in a way that had never existed before. One of my favorites is the interaction between the transistor and Elvis Presley. What the transistor did was it liberated teenagers from control of their parents around the radio. Because we used to have, right, you have this big radio that was plugged into the wall, like the TV was plugged into the wall, right? And the parents therefore held control of the plug. With a transistor radio, The kids could go out and, watch whatever they listen to, whatever they wanted to listen to. But they wouldn't buy it if there's nothing worth listening to. And then there was Elvis. So Elvis was kind of the killer app for the transistor radio. And neither would have grown up without the other. And it's this fascinating interaction. Well, the big Japanese companies grew up in the analog age, in which leading edge of competition was big, huge giants with very, very deep financial pockets. Most research and development business was being done by companies with at least 25,000 people. They were both integrated vertically and horizontally. It was the big horizontal keiretsu and the vertical corporate groups. They tried to do everything by themselves from soup to nuts. They didn't use outside skills. They prided themselves. We're not going to use that because we didn't invent it. Well, in the analog era, it's a whole different thing. We think of giant companies like Amazon, but Amazon did not invent Alexa. It was actually invented by a smaller company that worked with Amazon. Same with Gmail. The Pfizer vaccine was actually invented by a German startup created in Germany by a wife and husband who were immigrants from Turkey. So this interaction between larger companies and the startups and the whole idea of open innovation. So the way that you run a company is very different. And because of the power of computers, now instead of 70% of the research R&D being done in companies with at least 25,000 people, now it's only like 30%. And so much more of the research is being done by companies with only 500, or only 1,000 people, or only 100. Well, Sony and Panasonic are still operating in the skill sets learned in the analog age. They have not really figured out the digital age. And I'll give you one example. They use computers to cut costs, do the same tasks they were always doing, but just automate them and cut costs. But the whole point about information technology is you can do things you never did before. So one of my favorite examples is a Finnish fellow I met in Japan who had worked, he's getting his PhD in Japan. He'd worked as a consultant for a supermarket, a small chain of stores. And what he found out was that these small stores, like convenience stores, were using information technology to track the sale of every purchase, not only for inventory control, which costs, but to figure out customer buying patterns. And one of the things they discovered, which we never could have discovered without software and the right program, is that the same people on a Friday night who were buying Pampers also bought beer. Now, the notion of putting beer next to Pampers in the store was so antithetical. Alcohol with babies? Oh, no, people will freak out. But what happened was these parents with newborns had to stay home and take care of the baby. They wanted to plop in a VCR. This is a VCR era story. Plop it and watch a movie on the TV and have some beer. And so they pick up the Pampers, pick up the beer, and what they did is now move the Pampers next to the beer, and sales skyrocketed. Now, the idea of using technology to change what you do. In every UPS truck, there is a sensor which checks all kinds of things in terms of heat, stress, metal stress, et cetera, which you do with artificial intelligence. And as a result, they notice that they can't tell what's going to break down, but they notice there's certain symptoms in the truck before it breaks down. Heat goes this goes that. And so when you start seeing these symptoms, instead of having the truck deliver, you have it stop, something goes out, gets the truck, shifts the packages, and you get the packages there on time, instead of, the truck breaks down. Then we got to send someone out. The packages are late, customers are upset, blah, blah, blah. And so Japanese companies, even very, very big Japanese companies, have really not used all this incredible technology to be able to do new tasks that they never could have been done before at any cost. They've just taken the same tasks and try to cut their costs. The other social change technology has meant, this is a very long answer to a short question, but you can see I get wrapped up in these things. I just think it's cool stuff, really cool stuff. So if you were a new company trying to get into a market, you had to use the traditional distribution center, which was controlled by the big boys. And so it was very, very hard to get off the ground. Well, now one of the blessings of information technology is e-commerce. So here you have Rakuten, founded by this Harvard-educated MBA, right? Which sells the products of about 40, 50,000 small and medium companies who reach markets they never could have reached before in the traditional distribution system because they're using e-commerce. And there are companies that were selling, one company, this wraps up the interrelationship between generational change and technology. So it's a furniture maker, and its sales were about $1 million a year. And the founder died, and his kids took it over. Father never believed in e-commerce. He hated e-commerce, didn't understand it, made no sense to him. Once he died, the kids took it over. They went on Rakuten and other sites. 16 years later, their sales were not 1 million, but $160 million because of e-commerce. It never could have happened without e-commerce, not only as a technology, but as a social institution, which allowed new companies to bypass the traditional gatekeepers of the old distribution system, all of these wholesalers and retailers and stuff, and so allowed new companies to get off the ground. So technology creates economic changes, it creates social changes, and the companies that do not know how to use it to change the way that they operate are going to fall by the wayside. And one of the things that's allowed is that new companies which have better ideas and use e-commerce are being able to take away market share from some of these older companies that haven't changed their ways. And so the bargaining power impact, all sorts of impacts that technology has. And so, and as you see that integrates itself with generation, because which generation is much more eager to go after these technologies, understands them, grew up with them, it's part of their life. And so these megatrends interact, and that's what makes them very, very powerful.
And that leads nicely to the final megatrend, which is entrepreneurship, which has also been an undertone for pretty much all of the other megatrends as well. But could you talk a little bit about what role you think entrepreneurship will play in shaping Japan's future?
Now, these megatrends have impacts outside of entrepreneurship. The reason I got into it is I was to investigate whether internally within Japan, there were indigenous trends that would help it become more entrepreneurial like it used to be. If it were simply a matter of grafting onto Japan American practices, it would never work. I'm not a believer that people should, this notion of adopt the American system, the American model, I don't believe in that. In fact, there are lots of parts of the American model that don't work. So I think every country needs to learn from all over the place. And one thing Japan has been very good at historically is learning from others and then adapting things to its own purposes. So these other mega trends, I came to realize, there are a number of trends which allow more entrepreneurship. One is the general trend, the generational trend makes people both more eager and able to try to become an entrepreneur because they want to, but also the labor market has become more fluid. They are less afraid that if they take this job and it fails, they won't be able to get another good job. This is not true of the majority, but in countries that we consider very entrepreneurial, it's maybe 4%, 5% of the adult population which actually creates a company, and then another several percent who work for them. In Japan, we're talking about 2% rather than 4%. Well, it's half the amount, but we're not talking about a very large share of the population. So if you could even increase by 1 or 2% the percentage of adults who are willing to start a company and those who are willing to work for it, you'd have a very, very big change. And so the changes in the labor market has made it a more feasible choice. People's desire to do something interesting with their lives, and having grown up in an affluent society, people from graduate schools, from prestigious schools like Keio in the past would have gone to government or some big corporation. Now they're thinking about an entrepreneurship. I met a guy who's himself a former entrepreneur and a former funder of entrepreneurs, named Kurosaka, who teaches at Keio. And he brought in an entrepreneur, a Japanese entrepreneur, with a contest that is class of 100. They form 20 teams of 5 each for a business plan. And the entrepreneur said, the people with the best plan, I will fund your project. Well, it ended up, he thought 3 of them were good and 3 of them he wanted to fund. And the professor asked at the end of the class, how many people would consider either becoming an entrepreneur or working for one upon graduating? Half the class raised its hand. Now, okay, they're not going to do it. They're not going to do it, most of them, but that's okay. But suppose 5% of them did it or 10% of them did it. Well, that's a big deal. That's a big deal. And if they succeed, that creates a demonstration effect. You get companies that, another company I know that founded by American and Japanese together, 10 years ago, they couldn't hire enough people. And this year, they get 3,000 applications per year. And a lot of their employees are women, including their managers, because people want to try something new. Now, it's not only young people. You get people who are, say, in their late 40s, and their kids are grown up, and they have come to work for them from big companies. And you ask them, why do they come? And they said, because I've only got 10 more years or so to finally do something interesting in my career. And I want to build something. I want to create something. There are surveys of MBAs. One person did a survey comparing MBA students in Japan, United States, France, India, on attitudes like, I like to have my own idea and fight against others to make it come true. I'm willing to take a chance to do this. I don't mind being the only person with this idea. I love to create things. I love to see my ideas turn into reality. These sorts of ideas, which are very classic entrepreneurial kinds of mindsets. The MBAs in the United States and Japan were closer to each other in answering these questions than either country was to either France or India. And the idea that there's this big cultural block to entrepreneurship in Japan, no, it's that traditionally the risks of failure, the penalty for failure has been so high, and the rewards for success. If you look at Japan versus Korea and the number of, say, the richest 50 people in Japan and the richest 50 people in Korea, many more of the latter in Korea are actually self-made men, mostly men, not women, or a couple. And so in Japan, it's few and far between. So the risk-reward ratio is very, very different. The two biggest obstacles historically to entrepreneurship, one is recruiting people, and that's beginning to change a lot. The second one is getting finance, and that is not changing. That's a very, very big obstacle. The banks are just don't want to lend to people with whom they don't have a long relationship. It's like, we won't hire you to get experience. Well, how to get experience? Well, someone's got to hire you, but they won't hire you, you know? And so we won't lend you money to get big, but you can't get big unless we lend you money. And if you start off too small, you're going to fail. And the track record shows that. So that, to me, is the lack of change in the financial system is the biggest obstacle. The other issue is managerial skill. You've got all kinds of people who are visionaries, but they don't know anything about how to run a company. One of the highlights of my career was getting to interview Michael Dell. And I went down to Austin. Now, this shows the bad side of globalization is that I never had Texas barbecue, and I never went to a country western bar in Texas or anyplace else for that matter. And they said, oh, there's this very famous one on 6th Street in Congress in Austin. I went there, it was a Starbucks. It turned into a Starbucks. So that's the downside. But getting back to Michael Dell, this guy was a visionary. He created this company, but he almost lost it. He almost trashed it 3 times because he didn't know how to manage. He knew strategy, but he didn't know managerial nuts and bolts. He hired an MBA from Harvard who had worked at a Fortune 500 company. Nobody knows his name. Nobody hears about him, but he made him chief of operating officer. This guy had no vision, but he knew how to manage. He said, it took the both of us to make this company a success. I never could have done it by myself. Okay, so here you have all these people with vision who want to start companies. And what they end up doing is that they hire as managers people who have some experience in a larger company, who've been there at least 7 or 8 or 10 years, have gotten to the level of, say, at least Kacho. So they know something about how the business runs. They know something how to manage people, and they come. And so more of these Kachos, they go there and they say, okay, they will be willing to be hired. They're going to go and they'll teach the visionary how to actually manage the company. And in one case, it's called Roxul. It's an entrepreneurial company. And the guy who founded it at age 23. He had no experience in a big company. And he had this tremendous turnover. 40% of his people would leave every year. He didn't know how to solve it. So he said, I hired some veterans who were smarter than me. I said, you mean guys in their 50s? He goes, oh, no, guys in their 30s. And within 1 year, they turned it around. And the problem was that the people who joined his company did not join his company because it paid the most. They joined it because of its mission, how it was going to change Japan. They were doing something bigger than themselves, in a company that was bigger than itself. And he was not sort of encouraging them by talking about the mission and what their job, how their job related to the mission. And these people came there and they did it. Now that works with the type of people he was employing, their age level, their attitudes, whatever. And the problem, let's say on the side of women is, so if you don't get to instead of become a kacho at age 30, you don't get it until you're 38. You're not only much less likely to start your own company, you're also less likely to leave that company and then get hired by somebody else. So a lot of women are leaving earlier because then they can have these opportunities. So you have more people who'd like to become entrepreneurs if they thought it were realistic. You have more entrepreneurs who are showing success than ever before. Hardly enough, a drop in the ocean compared to what Japan could have, but still more. They're becoming more popular in the press. People are mostly thinking about Silicon Valley types, but there's the very unglamorous type as well that Japan needs. But still, demonstration projects that it can be done are going on. The ability to hire managers, have people who were willing to try it out and work for you. E-commerce, which allows you to find markets. So a lot of the traditional obstacles to starting a new company have really been lessened a great deal. The single biggest obstacle that remains is finance. And if you don't get enough finance at the start, you won't start off big enough. And if you don't start off big enough, you're much more likely going to fail. And so finance is really the biggest remaining obstacle. But unless Japan finds a way around that and deals with it, then it's not going to revive entrepreneurship. If it doesn't revive entrepreneurship, the overall economy, I don't think, is going to do an awful lot.
Right.
So there's a real potential here that's very, very exciting. And Japan has an opportunity. And we'll see if it has a potential that didn't exist 10 or 20 or 30 years ago. Mm-hmm. Doesn't mean it will happen. There's certainly no guarantees. If business as usual, it won't succeed. But business as usual is sort of coming apart anyway. So I think the field is opening up.
It's easy for people to fall into the trap of thinking that these changes are inevitable, but there are a lot of structural issues that need to be addressed to make these things possible.
Or the other problem is the fatalism of saying it can't be done. Shi-ka-ta it's never going to happen. And excess fatalism is just as corrosive as irrational exuberance. One of the biggest obstacles to doing what needs to be done is the feeling we tried several times, it failed. We thought Koizumi was going to do it. He failed. We thought the Democratic Party of Japan was going to do it. They failed. Abe made all his promises. We lost our hearts to him. He didn't do it. And so there's fatalism. And one of the purposes of the book is to show, no, Japan has done it before. There are real things happening that make it possible. And it really gets into the level then of politics, which is lagging behind these other societal changes.
Yeah, either way, thinking about it in terms of, oh, it'll happen anyway, we just have to wait it out, or having that fatalism, you are washing your hands of responsibility, when in reality, everybody kind of needs to proactively try to make these changes happen if we want them to actually take root. Absolutely.
And part of that process is just having, this kind of discussion. And again, technology, when you think of your podcast, you think of on LinkedIn, all of these groups with thousands of people who are getting to discuss it with other like-minded people, cross countries, sharing ideas. That's how ideas spread and grow and become embedded in society. So there's the social media here can play a very positive role, I think.
Well, thank you so much for your time today. Was there anything that we kind of skipped over that you wanted to address, or anything we forgot to cover?
Nah, we could go on for 17 hours, but
exactly.
I think we've covered what we need to cover, what your listeners have tolerance for.
All right, perfect. Well, hopefully we'll get your book soon as well, but I'll at least definitely link up to that article that you wrote about foreign direct investment that actually came up in a previous conversation as well. So I'll be sure to put that as a link in the description, as well as other places you can find Richard Katz and his writing. So thank you so much.
Great. Thank you.
I hope that you enjoyed today's conversation, and please be sure to check out the links in the description of this episode to learn more about Richard Katz and his writing about Japan, as well as to stay up to date on the book that he's working on now. If you enjoyed today's episode, go ahead and share it with a friend, colleague, or connection on LinkedIn to help spread the perspectives and information shared in the podcast. And please remember to go ahead and subscribe or follow on whatever platform you're using, and also leave a rating and review if you enjoy the podcast. You can also check out the podcast's new coffee page if you want to help keep me well caffeinated and making content. As always, feel free to email me at businesssuccessjapan@gmail.com if you have any other questions, comments, or suggestions for future episodes or interview topics. Also, be sure to reach out if you would like to contribute as a guest on the podcast to share your own cultural insights into doing business in Japan. I'd love to hear from you directly, so if you'd like to leave a voice message, you can find a link to do that in the description as well. But for now, remember that the more you learn, the more confident you will become as you explore all of the opportunities Japan has to offer you. Until next time, mata kondo.